This is Brescia Borden. In 2014, she and a friend were walking down the street, and they saw a bicycle and a scooter sitting alongside the road. They hopped on them, and they rode them off down the street. A lady came running out of the house, screaming at them that they were her kids' toys. So they stopped, they ditched the bike and the scooter, and they quickly walked away. Later, they were picked up, and they were charged with petty theft and burglary. Now, it's important to note that Brescia had 4 prior offenses. Each one of them were juvenile misdemeanors. This is Vernon Prater. In 2013, at the age of 41, he was picked up for stealing $80 worth of goods at Home Depot. Now, Vernon also had priors, but they were not juvenile misdemeanors. He had 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery. Now, at the time, the courts were experimenting with a program that would do some data analysis, run some algorithms, and try to determine if somebody was high risk of being a repeat offender or not. Now, the algorithm looked at Brescia, it looked at her 4 prior juvenile misdemeanors, and it determined that Brescia was a high risk. They gave her a score of 8. They looked at Vernon, they looked at Vernon's 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery, and the algorithm determined that he was low risk of being a repeat offender, and they gave him a score of 3. Hindsight being 2020, we can look at this and we know that they was absolutely wrong. She has had no subsequent offenses. He is serving 8 years for grand theft. Now, in isolation, this is disturbing enough. But it gets worse when you look at the actual aggregate data. So ProPublica dug in, and they wanted to see how often does this sort of thing happen. And so they looked at all the times that the algorithm got something wrong, and what they found was very disturbing. They discovered that if you were white, the most likely mistake that the algorithm would make was in assuming that you were low risk, that you were not going to be a repeat offender, when in fact you ended up repeat offending. If you were black, it made the opposite mistake. It assumed that you were high risk, when in fact you ended up not having any subsequent offenses. The algorithm that was in part built to pull away human bias was itself biased. You know, there's a lot of talk right now about whether or not technology is political, whether or not technology is biased. But of course it is. It can't help but be political and biased because we, the people building it, are political and biased, and we infuse those biases into the technology we build, whether or not we realize it. And sometimes, in retrospect at least, it's obvious. But here's the thing. We don't build algorithms like this. I'm willing to bet most of you in here do not do things like this. We're at Fluent. We're front-end developers. We're designers. We write HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We work on retail sites, on social media sites, for startups, for financial institutions. We don't impact people's lives in the same way. But our limited perspective and our biases end up influencing the way that we build each and every day, and even if the impact isn't quite as obvious at first glance, it's still there. There are 3.5 billion people connected to the internet today. It's a mind-blowing number. It's even more staggering when you stop to consider just how very different those experiences are. We used to just worry about which of the major browsers people would come and navigate our sites on, and those were the easy days. You know, now people are connecting using low-end phones, using tablets, using high-end desktop machines. They're connecting over slow mobile networks, over cable connections, over publicly shared Wi-Fi. They're browsing from home, from work, from a coffee shop. They're looking for information, for employment, for entertainment. They're young, they're old, they're rich, they're poor. Literally, the only thing that they all have in common is that they are all trying to access the internet, the single largest repository of human knowledge ever assembled. There is so much that we do not know. There is so much that extends beyond our limited perspective. And yet, despite all this variability, the web has from the very earliest days been emboldened by this grandiose vision that it could possibly be for everyone. The theoretical promise of the web is that all of these people with their different backgrounds, with their different social and economical and political positions, they all get to access the web. And it becomes a platform for empowerment. It empowers rural farmers to control their own destiny. It empowers women to be financially and socially independent in cultures where that's frowned upon. It gives people a platform to have their voices be heard. And more importantly, it lets us hear from people who have a very different day-to-day reality than what we have. That's the promise of the web. That's the theory, at least. The reality is we frequently fall short of this. We let our own bias and our own limited perspectives of what it means to use technology influence the way we build, and in the process, we leave people out. There are numerous organizations that attempt to quantify the state of connectivity by looking at what barriers, what obstacles are in the way. One of them is the GSMA Connectivity Index, and it focuses on 4 categories. The first is consumer readiness. How aware are people of the technology? Do they have the skills to use it? Are they literate? Are digital literacy? If I give you a device, do you know how to get the information you're looking for? But also cultural acceptance. So in India, 114 million more men than women have cell phones. In an article about the topic, a village elder said it was because mobile phones are considered to be dangerous for women. Now, I am not here to comment on any of sort of the religious beliefs or cultural beliefs that lead to something like that. That's not my place, but I think it is apparent that if we have an entire demographic that doesn't have equal access to a technology, then cultural acceptance is a barrier to widespread access. The second barrier to access is content. Lack of localized content or availability of services. Can they get to social media, banking, financial, education institutions? We often frame this from the perspective of, do local services exist? But it's just as important if they can access external resources. You know, in China, we have 700 million people who are behind the Great Firewall of China. And last I looked, it was filtering out, 8 of the top 25 sites on the web? Those are potentially valuable resources that they don't have access to. The third category is affordability. Low income or purchasing power, cost of ownership of a device, cost of a data plan, taxes, fees, that sort of thing. And while it's true that costs are generally very slowly trending down, we continue to insist to make this a little bit of a problem. This was a beautifully laid out interview article when Johnny Ive was talking about the Apple Touch Bar. Really gorgeous design. But there was a couple things wrong. First off, I was always taught that when you give a presentation, you make sure that your battery is full on your screenshots and you make sure that the page finishes loading. But it was just taking too long. I couldn't wait for this particular one. And the reason why is if you would have profiled it, as Adi Asmani did, you would have discovered that it was loading 131 megabytes over a mobile connection. 131 megabytes. I mean, this layer99.jpg, that is the worst drinking song ever invented. 99 layers of images on the site, 99 layers. 131 megabytes. And if you look at what that means in terms of affordability, what you find out is in some places around the world, that's costing anywhere from 50 to 85% of the daily income to view a single solitary interview article. So cost continues to be an issue. And finally, the fourth category is infrastructure, so lack of coverage or access. We think about this a lot in terms of, can they get to a mobile network? If they can get to a mobile network, is it the latest and greatest mobile network available? But sometimes it's more simple than that. Sometimes it's the lack of adjacent supporting infrastructure. In Tanzania, 15% of the population has access to electricity. And the electricity that they can access is not the electricity you and I are used to. It's prone to error and failure, and so as a result, those with access use only about 89 kilowatt hours annually. To put that in perspective, in the US, the average American uses 107 kilowatt hours in 3 days. It's a very different day-to-day reality. So the Connectivity Index looks at these different categories. It looks at consumer readiness, at content, at affordability, at infrastructure, and it scores each of the countries. And if you were to look at the results, what you'd find out is that the United States is near the top. We come in at number 7. Australia is number 1. You can see there's not a huge gap here. It's pretty close to a similar experience. Contrast that with something like India, where they're at the lower to end of the middle of the range of connectivity index, or something like Chad or Niger at the very, very bottom of the list. And there is a huge gap. We have as ideal a view of what it means to use the web as we could possibly have. And I understand that, when we look at all these problems, it seems a little bit overwhelming. It can be very difficult to get past, and Jen is absolutely right. It's not easy to build like this. It's not easy to build for the web. And it's not ideal to have to play within these constraints, but the less than ideal is absolutely inherent in the web, and we forget that sometimes. The web moves so fast, and we all feel the pain of trying to keep up. We struggle to follow whatever the new framework is, whatever the new build tool is. And we focus so much on what's coming tomorrow that we do it at the expense of today. We forget what's possible now. But while we debate whether or not to use React or Angular or Ember or Vue, there are people around the world, there are people down the street who have much graver concerns. There are people down the street and around the world who have to battle censorship to get the information that they need. There are people down the street and around the world who, if their data is exposed because of some sort of a security flaw, it's more than an inconvenience. It can impact their livelihood. There are people down the street and around the world who can't afford the latest and greatest device. They can't afford a big data plan. They can't afford to be on a big, fast connection at home. There are people down the street and around the world who have a physical or visual impairment that makes it difficult for them to use the technology, the same technology that we use every day and we take for granted. You know, these three things, security, accessibility, performance, Paul Lewis famously called them the unsexy pillars of the web a few years back. They're critical, they're fundamental, but they're underappreciated and underdiscussed. And it's these three things, in our decision whether to focus on them or not, that ends up deciding who gets to use the technology that we build. Are we making sure that we're using HTTPS so that people's information is private, so that they can battle censorship? Are we making sure that we're not leaving our sites exposed to security flaws that may leave our users' information available free for the taking? Are we making sure that we're building sites and applications that people can use regardless of what physical or visual impairment that they may have to deal with? The web is meant to be for everyone, and that matters. And we get riled, I think we all know that. That's why we get so riled up about net neutrality concerns, because we understand that everyone should have access to the full web, and it should not matter what they can afford, and it should not matter where they're from. But folks, if we don't take the time to make sure that our sites are accessible, that they're secure, that they're performant, if we don't focus on those fundamentals, then we are not giving people equal access to the web. We're letting our perspective, we're letting our biases determine who gets to use our sites and applications and who doesn't. The web is chaotic and it's unpredictable, and sometimes that feels very overwhelming, but put yourself in your user's shoes and imagine how much more overwhelming it is when you find your access blocked at every single step you take. We, the people in this room, we are the user's last line of defense. It's on us to make sure that we build a web that can be used regardless of someone's background, regardless of what they can afford, regardless of the constraints that they have to deal with. It's on us to make sure that we build a web that truly is for everyone. Thank you.